In terms of tiled backsplashes, even if it's a white ceramic tile, you want to have some value down first with your gray marker. I'm starting with my 1 in the light, and I'll use my 3 in the 3 in the middle value. Otherwise, you can't see the lightest part of them. It won't show up. You can't see light unless it's contrasted with something darker. This is our 5. To set up your tiles, if you don't want to have a strong black line between them, that will make them look less white. They won't look quite so bright. You can put maybe a pencil crayon line for now, just to outline where you want them to be. Because I find if you put a really dark line for your tiles, it makes the overall thing a very dark impression, and we're trying to say that they're white or very light. Put a little shadow. Now this area can be very small and it's a little tricky, but it'll read once you start getting it all in. Now I might have to go back in with my 1 and put a little more value on the face of this, because the light, where we want our light to gather, is at the plane change from front to side. So we want it to be here, and I don't think we'll be able to see that unless I go a little darker on the face. Now, I know these are tiny areas and it may not seem worth doing this, but it's the only way to get the tile to look as if it's a tile. And then, of course, you can take your white paint. See, isn't this funny? But these are still not dark enough, so I go back with my 3 for a little more. And some, you could do some this way and leave some alone, so that it's gradually getting lighter or appearing lighter as you go. And then in the 3, you would shadow with the 5. Maybe just even being aware of where the lightest part of it would be might help you with something else that you're doing. I can't guess at what everybody's going to choose to do, so I'm just trying to give you sort of general things that you might find in the kitchen. Now this will be much easier to get our light to stand out, and we'll use our 7 to shadow our 5. And of course it would be much easier just to put in a black line, a thick black line, but it doesn't give the impression of how white tiles really are. In an elevation, that's the way to do it. They're just too tiny, you would never get this across otherwise. Hopefully we'll see this a little better here. These always take a little coaxing. These pens. So this is the part that's turned away from the light. This is the part that's in the light. And here we'll see it most of all. And see it pretty brightly in the shadow. This is one instance where you do see it pretty brightly. Never get this to go on other than blobby, but maybe you have better luck with it. And could even put some dashes like this in the parts that are a little bit lighter in the shadow. If you have a stone backsplash, then you could do the same thing. Now it'll probably be a little darker, so you can start with your 3 this time. And this is the 5. And you could go in now with your, probably just your white pencil. If you don't want to get it too busy or too dark, you could start to play around with some textures just with the marker itself, and you would sweep it across the whole tile, the whole backsplash. You'd begin to do a little bit that scribbling that we did before to get some different values going. We can pick this up too with our pencil crayon. With stone you always use a little bit of dot. We're going to do more of this. That was the 3 on the 3. This is the 5 on the 5. If you have, just pass it over just ever so slightly. Of course, we could have done this when it was wet, but then you wouldn't see any of this much. And it's disappearing, so don't worry, it'll disappear. Just other ways to play with it and experiment with texture. It also made it a little darker so that when we put the tile lines in with a white pencil, we'll still see them. Because you may prefer to use a white pencil to outline your tiles this time. And you worry it. You go back and forth and back and forth. And all these things, when you're done, you have to go back and reassess them once they're dry. Now I'm going to step it up and use the 5 for the shadow here. And just down one side. Now again, on the elevation you would use the black line. It's just too small. But on a perspective, sometimes you can get away with this if you can get it dark enough. And now, of course, we need some black pencil crayon for dots and textures, and don't forget to twirl. That's the only way it's going to stay on, is if you twirl. We could try and put a little bit of white over on this edge this time. This white was a reflection because it's such a reflective, shiny surface. But this time, this is the highlight because this is the part that's closest to the light. So it would be very bright. Your gouache would be better for that, actually, than that. And this is our 5 for this rendition. Sometimes they're beautiful variegated colors of stone. And you might consider, if it's a dark stone, you could just step it up to the next darkest marker. And here we can put in some dots. Don't forget to twirl. And here we can put some more texture as well. Probably better to do this before you put the pencil crayon down, because I don't think this material likes the pencil crayon very much. And you can smudge these things with your finger too to get different effects, to soften them. We've done a lot of wood grain on our floors. We've never really used pencil crayon with it. Always have 2 values of marker when you set out. So let's try doing something a little darker. Why not apply it with a movement to start with? Because the grain is such movement, it's alive. So we'll start with some movement. While it's wet, we'll add some of this 3. And then we'll add some 5 in a little bit lesser amounts. And that should be enough for our areas in the light. And we'll let that dry a bit. Then the next one, we'll start with our 3. This will be parts that are, and see, I'm leaving some of the paper untouched so that the next marker will fill that in more fully. So it'll blend in the parts that were. And I'm not concerned about drawing because I know that I can use my pencil crayon to draw over top. So this is that was the 3 and the 5. This is now the 5 and the 7, where it would be in shadow. Remember, we can see through our shadows though, so you don't want to make it too opaque. This rendering with markers has a lot in common with, and if you just skim, don't press, but just skim, you can get kind of natural grains, wood grains. It has a lot in common, marker rendering, it has a lot in common with watercolor, working with watercolor, if you've ever done that. Because we should be able to see through the pigment all the way to the paper, makes it a little brighter. Planking always helps. And this you would put in, well, you could put it in with your pencil if you wanted it to be a little softer. And some people actually use a graphite pencil for this. They don't want it to look harsh. And then you can go in and put more texture and more lines in with your pencil crayon. And don't forget too, in planking there are these lines as well. You have to divide up your sections. And now we've got a variegated color effect with our wood grain. And pattern's always a little bit darker in the shadow than it is in the light. Now most of the surfaces and countertops, the top surfaces in particular, are reflective in a kitchen, are highly glossed. So for example, if you had a rosewood, a dark rosewood top on your island, you would really see, especially the task lighting right above, is really going to show a bright, bright highlight. So you would reserve, that was my 3, this is my 5, you would reserve your pencil crayon work until the very end, because if you tried to put your highlights in, your bright highlights, with your pencil crayon, after putting grain on with a pencil crayon, it wouldn't work. You wouldn't see it. You could always use your white gouache, but sometimes it leaves a hard edge and it doesn't look quite so convincing. But the thing about woods like this is that part of the grain is extremely dark and part of it is very light. That's what gives it that beauty, that translucency too, because you can see through the lighter parts of it. And I can even start now to put some reflections in with the darker values. And let that dry. It's got to dry. It's got to be very dry before you put the pencil crayon on top of it as well. But we'll let that dry. See, there are some very light parts and then some very dark parts. Parts I'm going to maybe put in a little darker even. That's the whole beauty of it, is that contrast of some very strikingly dark parts and then the more lighter areas of the wood as well. And this is the 7 on this side and then the 5 on the other, because there's not much to see here in this. I don't have any pencil crayon under this, and I'm checking to see that it's dry, and then underneath the light I'm going to go in and make the richest white that I can get with this pencil to show the gloss. And you really worry it. So I've got a bit of miasma and I'm going right down the center of it to try and get the most striking. And I'm just softening on either side. And it seems a little ridiculous to put so much focus on this, but it will make a big difference in your rendering. And then I'm going to put a little over here as well. You don't want them all to be the same size either. And when you're done with that, down the center now, you might put in a little bit of white gouache so that you have an even brighter spot. And you can leave it or brush it with your finger. And of course the brightest one is the one at the very start. And there's also light gathering at the edges. Now if you forgot and you put some wood grain with your pencil crayon in first before putting in the highlight, and you can't get your pencil crayon to show up at all, you can do the whole thing with the gouache. You just have to be very careful and not get the paper too wet. And go back and soften so that it's not a harsh stripe right down the middle of the wood. Often you'll have to go back and retrieve your outline. After you've been rendering a while, don't forget that you really do have to keep an eye on your outlines. You might lose them, and you gotta go back and get them. Light gathers at edges and corners, so we can put a little dot on the corner.